A recent report from Ontario's Auditor General laid out some stark facts about pandemic-era relief spending. For example, in the mad scramble to keep the economy from crashing completely, the AG found that Ontario paid almost $1 billion in COVID-19 relief to ineligible businesses. With us now for a closer look, and as is our custom here, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital, in the Glebe. There's Ian Lee, Associate Professor at Carleton University's Sprott School of Business. And in the provincial capital, in the East End, Mitch Davidson, Executive Director of Strategy Corp's Institute of Public Policy. He's formerly Executive Director of Policy for Premier Doug Ford. At Yonge and Bloor, NDP advisor Kim Wright, who's principal at Wright Strategies. And just a few subway stops closer at Summerhill, Deb Matthews, former Deputy Premier and Liberal Cabinet Minister, and it's great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Let's just, before we get into our discussion here, take a look at some of the highlights of what the Auditor General found as it related to the distribution of pandemic relief spending. For example, Sheldon, bring up this graphic if you would. Relief programs for businesses cost $11.2 billion, about a third of the money that was set aside for provincial COVID-19 relief. Here are the details now. More than $210 million from the Ontario Small Business Support Grant was given to 14,500 ineligible recipients. And the government apparently didn't make any attempts to recover this money. The money many businesses received was more than their reported revenue loss, meaning they actually made money off the program. Some businesses that got funding may not even have been based in Ontario. A CEO of a company that got a $2.5 million contract was actually part of the province's vaccine task force. At least $16 million in energy rebates and property tax were handed over to more than 3,000 ineligible businesses. And ministries relied heavily on self-reported information. There was no centralized tracking of where the money went or whether or not it was effective. Now, let's get the quote of the AG on the record here. As a consequence, she said, of speeding up the delivery of programs once a funding decision was made, eligibility controls were either missing entirely, poorly designed, or not applied. Let's figure this out. Mitch, you want to get us started? How does something like this happen?
Sure. I mean, the reality is that the government was in the middle of a crisis and it needed to get this money out the door as quickly as possible. So a traditional program that you would use to give money back to people, like, say, a tax credit, businesses would have had to wait till the end of the year, and that might have been closing their doors permanently. So the government chose a faster method, which had less controls in place. And yes, some overpayments were made, and that's an unfortunate consequence, but it's much better than the reality of letting businesses fail because we were too slow to get money out the door. So I think we've identified that government is pretty good at taking money out of people's pockets, and it might not be that good at putting it back into people's pockets.
Ian, when you first heard what the government's plans were, did you sort of calculate that, well, we have to expect this after all, we're doing it quickly, we're trying to help people, that's the way it goes?
I certainly predicted it because it was inevitable when any government says, look, it's an emergency, we have to get the money out the door quickly. I mean, I interpret that as almost a code talk for saying we are going to suspend due diligence. We're going to suspend the checks and balances that normally apply for, old age pension or unemployment insurance or that sort of thing. And so inevitably, once you make that decision to suspend those due diligence checks, there's going to be money that is issued that should not have been issued, and there won't be the controls in place to catch it or detect it.
Kim, given the nature of the emergency, and we have to remember it really was very dire, was it necessary for the government to, as Ian suggests, suspend the normal due diligence it does before shoveling money out the door?
It was necessary to get the money out the door. I'm not certain that the oversight was there at all, even contemplated. But there was other things that the AG talked about in terms of lack of consultation of the people who were going to get the money, who needed the money from certain industries that were frankly left out of the cold. So this was a rush job because the provincial government had spent so much time finger pointing at the feds, hoping that they would do it. And the feds were finger pointing at the province, hoping they would do it. And at the end of it all, too many people, families, individuals, businesses kept getting left out in the cold. Were there some challenges of oversight? Sure. But there was also just problems with how the program was set up in the first place. And that needs to be looked at going forward because this isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Deb Matthews, just before I get you to comment, apparently one of your Liberal Eastern Ontario MPPs, Amanda Simard, is a big fan of Oprah, because her comment was, the PC government is a bit, well, a terrible version of Oprah with taxpayers' money is the way she put it. She said, you get a grant, you get a grant. Outside of Ontario, you get a grant. You're not eligible? Whatever, you get a grant anyway. Everybody gets a grant. Okay, that's pretty funny, but is that really a fair characterization of what went on here?
Well, Steve, when as I read the AG report, half of the money that went to ineligible companies, half the money. There's something very seriously wrong. And, you know, there are a whole bunch of things to talk about here. I'm sure we'll get to them all, but let's just focus on the timeline for a minute. On December 17th, the then Minister Rod Phillips, gave instructions to the ministry on setting up the criteria. 2 days later, the 19th of December, it was submitted to Treasury Board. And 2 days later, December 21st, it was announced. That is so ridiculously speedy. And then when you think about the timeline of the finance minister being on his vacation in St. Bart's, he was away when this was happening. So I think there are some serious questions about competence and about rushing it out the door. You know, when you send money to companies that don't operate in Ontario, when, as I say, half the money goes to ineligible companies, and then you make the decision that you're not going to try to collect, you're just going to write it off.
Well, hold off on that. We're gonna come back to whether they should have gone to get it. But I want to ask you a follow-up, because I think you were president of the Treasury Board once upon a time in this province.
Yes,
So you just put a timeline forward that basically says between idea and out the door, it's 4 days.
4 days.
In your judgment, based on your experience, I guess a two-part question. How long should that take if everybody's doing due diligence? And do you have any sympathy for the speed with which they had to make decisions here, given the nature of the emergency? They
had to make decisions. They had to make them quickly, but they took everything at face value. They had no criteria. It was a very poor job with an absent minister.
Mitch, a poor job with an absent minister. Fair characterization?
No, I don't really think so. I think Ontarians needed that relief, and they needed it quickly. I mean, I think the former minister will recall when she was in office, there was an ice storm in 2013, 2014, and the government chose to give relief money back in the form of gift cards, and those went to people who were not eligible as well. The reality is that you have to put yourself in the shoes of the business owner. If you are facing a real risk to your livelihood, a chance that your business may not survive, you apply for the program. And if the government made a wrong decision on eligibility, which the auditor pointed out many other businesses should have been eligible, then this is a way to fix that eligibility, is to continue to hand out the money to those businesses, even if they don't meet the parameters of the program. So I would think of it more as, yes, it was a quick job to get it out the door. They just made those other policy changes while the program was operational, rather than waiting to get them right before the program started, because he needed to get that money into people's pockets immediately.
Your predecessors didn't do $1 billion in gift cards, though. This is big dollars. Does that matter?
Yeah, but I would just say, I mean, you know, I've heard some comparisons about $1 billion in gas plants. You know, to me, the idea is that the scandal on the previous government was giving money to insiders and friends, and the scandal on the Conservative government is giving money back to taxpayers. We're really talking about a government giving too much money back to its own businesses in the time of crisis. I think if you asked the Premier, Premier Ford, that this program was going to cost $1 billion more than he thought, but it would keep businesses afloat, he would have said, great, let's put an extra $1 billion in the program, because that's what we really needed to do, was make sure that those businesses were going to be able to survive the pandemic.
Well, Ian, let's look at the setup for this. Obviously, the government said the emergency is such that we're not going to be able to do the due diligence we normally do. We're going to have to rely kind of on the honor system here. Was there any other way to set this up?
Yes, there was. About 20 years ago in our country, it's not the royal we, our elected officials properly, from all the political parties, made a very major decision to go towards e-government. In plain English, all government is now digitized, including, most importantly, the tax collection system. Again, in even more plain English, that means everybody files a return. 31 million people filed returns last year. They're in the database, and over 2 million corporations are required by law, both profit and nonprofit must file. What that means is that the database holds awesome information on every variable that's on the tax returns, where you live, your bank account, and so forth. So to get quickly to the point, any government could have pushed the money out the door far more quickly, actually, than what was done by simply going, the cabinet minister or the premier or the prime minister going to the minister responsible for revenue and saying, tell your public servants to reverse the pipeline. And I call the pipeline, the tax normally flows in from business and consumers to the government. When you reverse the pipeline, think HST rebates and carbon tax rebates, the revenue department, CRA, credits the bank account of the designated group that the ministers have decided upon, everybody below $60,000, or every business with revenues below $100,000. I mean, fill in the blank. The beauty of a digital database is you can filter, slice, and dice the data 18,000 ways to Sunday.
Right. Okay, we get you.
They could have done it that way in a much more targeted manner.
Let me find out from Kim. Kim, you run a business. Do you think it could have been done that way?
It absolutely could have. And, Deb talked about the 4 days between conception to, application phase. It didn't have to be this way. I mean, we were dealing with the pandemic since March. We were looking at the restrictions and the furthering of restrictions for months beforehand. They knew that businesses were struggling. They decided not to do this. And this is what happens when you have a government that has much disdain for government. They don't want to do the programs. They don't look at these things as a wholesale. How do you actually help people? How do you actually put the proper metrics in place? How do you put the things in place that you need? Steve, we only need to look at schools. They've known for years, decades, in fact, that the ventilation systems in schools and in long-term care facilities were terrifyingly bad. They could have done RFPs a year in the early stage of the pandemic in the summer. They waited an extra year. It's the same thing of this. They want credit and the gold star for, we tried to help businesses. But at the end of the day, they weren't doing anything to help people all the way through. They were just sort of ham-fisting it and hoping no one would notice the finance minister was in St. Bart's.
Mitch, any idea why they didn't choose to do it the way that Ian and Kim have just described?
Well, I would just say simply it's worth pointing out that Ontario doesn't control its own tax system. It's got an agreement with the Canada Revenue Agency, and so the federal government would be one that would be rebating programs through the tax system, and normally they wait till year end. You'll notice that the federal government themselves, when they were designing support programs, most notably CERB for people, they did not do it through the tax system. They did it as an application-based system as well. So clearly, both the federal government and the provincial government understood that the speed was faster if they did it through an application-based program rather than if they did it through the tax system, and that's really what we're talking about here.
All right, Deb, let me circle back then to the second point you were trying to make when I interrupted you, which is having got the money out the door and having realized that a lot of it went to people who shouldn't have got it, what potential processes does the government then have to get the money back? Do they have any?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely they do. Probably Ian could speak more on the technicalities of how they would do that. But you can't just put money out the door and not even try to collect it, write it off for what appeared to me to be political reasons. They didn't want to disturb people during COVID with having to pay back money they shouldn't have gotten in the first place. So, I've got a problem with that. And you layer that on top of the $1 billion they wrote off on the 407. And then you layer on top of that $6 billion. It'll be way more than that if it ever gets built on the 413. This is money that could go to so many other things. I think, we're all thinking about rapid testing right now. We're all thinking about how are we going to have a Christmas with the people we love, please, safely. This money could have gone into rapid testing for people, giving us a lot more peace of mind, and caught earlier positive cases of COVID. So, there's a lot of places that money could have been spent, and it breaks my heart, actually, because I can imagine the difference it would make if it was put in the right places.
Well, okay, they could have done it, but Kim, follow up on that if you would. It's one thing to be able to do something. It's another thing to decide to do it. Is it politically advisable for the government at this stage to go to the thousands of businesses that shouldn't have got this money but did and say, we want some of that back?
Well, I think they're going to have to look at this, and people will find their political pound of flesh wherever they can out of this. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that for the next emergency, that there is better oversight of any of these programs, because there are going to be additional measures. We've started to hear rumblings about these types of things. Businesses are continuing to suffer. Certainly, property taxes will still need to be paid, and municipalities will still need to be made whole for some of the public health spending that's out there. But there are lots of things that this government should be focusing on. They've been sitting on millions of rapid tests. They could have been giving those out to school children well before now. They could have been doing a number of public health measures. And Steve, you'll remember, and I talk about this only because right before the pandemic, the Ford government was actually trying to cut public health units across the province. So again, governing is choosing, and show me your budget, I'll tell you your priorities. And their priorities were not helping people get back to work. They could have also instituted paid sick leave, not just, oh, we'll guarantee your job. That doesn't help someone pay the rent. And we need to make sure that when you're looking at government policies, how are you helping people? How are you moving forward? And how are you doing your job to keep society going? And what we see with this auditor's report is on every measure that these things had failed, and there were too many people who weren't looking at what was best for Ontarians, but rather what was best for politics.
Well, okay, let me stay with that. Mitch, this is admittedly a more political as opposed to economic question, but here we are 6 months before the next provincial election. There are lots of small businesses in this province who already feel pretty hard done by some of the decisions that the current government of Ontario made. If you were advising the Premier right now, do you think it's politically advisable to go after the thousands of businesses that got money that shouldn't have and tell them to pay it back?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction here. And I think the Premier was right that he'd go after the businesses where it was fraudulent, those who may not have actually had an operational business or who weren't in the province of Ontario. But the money that went to ineligible businesses that still needed relief, even the auditor said that they should have been included in the program, I don't think it is advisable to go after those businesses. The reality is that the pandemic is still ongoing. And so, this support money, I would think of it more as a life raft, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that these businesses have made it to shore and to safety yet. There's still a long way to go. Even Dan Kelly, the head of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, said, we've seen a lot of small business deaths. We just haven't had the funerals yet. And I think we're still in a very trepidatious time for these business owners. So going and saying, hey, well, you're struggling and there's potential for more restrictions coming and there's all these capacity issues that you have, give us back $10,000, $20,000. I don't think that's a smart move politically, and I don't think it's a smart move economically as well.
Ian, let me follow up with you on that because okay, let's put it this way. I know it's always easier to blame politicians whenever anything goes wrong. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know that every single one of the businesses that applied for this money did so fraudulently. A lot of them may have done it by error. They just didn't know if they were eligible or not, so they thought, what the heck, we'll try it. But at the end of the day, how much responsibility do the people who applied for these programs need to take themselves for the fact that they got money that they shouldn't have?
Complete responsibility. Steve, many, many years ago, back in the 70s, early 80s, I was a banker. I lent money. And if we put money in and from time to time mistakes are made and a customer was credited money that was a mistake on the bank's part, and they had a legal, this has been tested in the courts and determined, they had a legal responsibility and a legal liability to repay the money to which they were not entitled. And so if the government doesn't go after it, I think it's encouraging moral hazard. In the next pandemic or the next crisis, people say, hey, look, they don't go after us if we file claims that are not completely legit. And then secondly, to answer your question, individuals are not entitled at law to money. They're not entitled to keep money that they weren't entitled to in the first place.
Okay, so you're saying that 6 months before an election, the province of Ontario ought to go it and try and get that money back?
Well, that I'm not addressing the political question, Steve. I'm talking about the pragmatic question. I think most Canadians understand that, if they were given money by mistake because it was credited to their bank account, for example, then they are not entitled to keep it and they must repay it. And that's really the principle I'm invoking. It's not only a legal principle, but it's a common sense understanding, I think, that you're not entitled to keep what was not due to you in the first place.
Understood. Okay, we have been talking about the Auditor General, who's an independent actor in the Ontario legislative system, and I want to just shift focus briefly now to another independent actor, an independent agent in the Ontario political system, and that's the Financial Accountability Officer, because he too has been looking at some of the numbers associated with all of this, and he found that in the first quarter of this year, the Ontario government had not distributed any of the $2.7 billion that they had earmarked to fight COVID-19. And in last month's mini-budget, this is the fall economic statement that came out not that long ago, it was revealed that they spent $3.5 billion less than planned on health care. Now, Mitch, start us off here. Why does the government appear to be, on the one hand, shoveling money out to people who are not eligible for it, and on the other hand, not spending money that they have already budgeted to take care of other important problems?
Yeah, I actually think it's a fairly simple answer. You budget in a crisis for the worst case scenario, right? You put aside as much money as you could possibly need if things are going to go very poorly. And every time that things are better than expected, you don't have to spend that money. So every time that an Ontarian does not get the virus, does not have to go to a testing facility, does not have to end up in an ICU bed, does not have to be, transported by air ambulance to a hospital with extra capacity, that not only is good for that individual, that's good for the economy, but it also saves the government money because they don't have to spend on those things. So it's actually a good thing that we're spending less than we had put aside for COVID, because that means that there is less COVID in Ontario today than was anticipated. Ideally, everybody on this panel should agree that we want to get to a place where we have to put $0 aside for COVID. That's the future that we're working to. And just so in this scenario, we are spending less than budgeted because we've had less transmission of the virus than the worst case scenarios have projected. And that is actually a good thing.
I got to do a follow-up with you on that, though, Mitch, because the Financial Accountability Officer also pointed out that there are probably, because of the pivot required in the healthcare system, there are probably $1.3 billion worth of diagnostic tests that did not happen because the healthcare system said, we haven't got time to do those right now. We got to focus on COVID. If you've got $3.5 billion set aside, contingent on, and you haven't spent it, and there's $1.3 billion of tests, diagnostic breast cancer tests, elective surgeries that have not been done, have you got a problem here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue here is now about capacity, right? And so I wish that we could, walk and chew gum at the same time when it came to healthcare professionals being able to do all these things. But hospitals are prioritizing their internal decision making, and they're focusing on things. There's not a single hospital in Ontario that didn't ask for more money and then not receive it, right? So those hospitals are making those operational decisions that they have to make in order to make sure that they can process COVID cases. I wish that we were at a place where we could do both, and I think hopefully the government can get there. But the reality is that's a capacity issue with the amount of healthcare professionals we have in this province, which is another debate, which we can blame some of that on government. We can blame some of that elsewhere. But I think when you're talking about the finances, the Premier has said that he's not going to spare a single penny. And frankly, he's actually been putting that money out the door, even if it's not as much as he budgeted in a rainy day situation.
Deb Matthews, let me get your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really disturbing comment, Mitch. There is real need in the healthcare system. Patients are waiting. We just look at rapid tests, right? There are lots of ways you can put more money into the system to have better outcomes, fewer cases of COVID, and to just say, oh, we don't have enough people in the system. That is very upsetting, actually, to hear that. This is a government that I don't think has fully grasped how serious COVID is. I think, when Sylvia Jones said, oh, we're not going to do anything now because we have to wait to see if the modeling comes true. And that kind of epitomizes for me the attitude of this government. It's been grossly incompetent. It has had its priorities wrong. And to leave over $3 billion in dedicated healthcare spending that mostly came from the federal government, let's not forget, unspent I think is a tragedy.
You referenced Sylvia Jones, the Solicitor General of the current government. Kim, what's your view on the unspent money, budgeted but not spent?
Well, the interesting thing, Steve, is if you look back to the SARS report, that was pretty detailed in how best to deal with these type of pandemics going forward. One of the things they talked about was having a dedicated hospital for SARS-like patients and then making sure other hospitals were operationalized. They could have done that in this case with COVID, looking at where were the needs, where could we have brought things in, could we have the the medical camps type of thing to make sure that all of the other patients, the heart patients, cardiac patients, the cancer patients, were still being triaged and given those diagnostic capabilities. That didn't happen, let alone what could have been done if we had actually had rapid testing or paid sick leave. I look at the family that was in Brampton, the father who was trying his best to keep his family going, and then he and his young daughter die of COVID. Come on, like, don't tell me that you were managing the pandemic, Steve, and we were underspending in healthcare. The entirety of how we were doing things is actually healthcare. Then when we look at, other things that have been underspent on under the COVID cover, as I want to call it, look over here, let's talk about COVID, as opposed to the autism funding program that has been woefully underfunded, woefully rolled out. There are about 600 families that are going through when there's about 50,000 that should be eligible. There are so many things that this government has not spent the money on. Let's talk about long-term care. Let's talk about people who are on ODSP and Ontario Works and how they are not being held up to a good quality standard of funding. Those are things that should be priorities for a government in Ontario that is worried about public health. And how do we maintain the healthcare system? And how do we maintain Ontarians' quality of life? But to say we're underfunding this by a few billion and a few million here and there so they can look better on their books, that to me is abhorrent.
Well, let me ask Ian about that, because, the fact is, during the fall economic statement, the deficit of the province of Ontario was a lot smaller than had been anticipated a year earlier. Is there an argument to be made that if you've got money budgeted for something and you, in your judgment, feel you don't need to spend it on that, put it towards deficit reduction and keep that deficit number as low as possible?
I'm sure you know, Steve, this has been debated literally going back to the emergence of democracy in the Middle Ages in England. And that's the whole question of, the authority of Parliament. And I won't get into that historical debate. I actually, if I can answer it in a slightly different way, because this is my one of my favorite subjects that I like to research. I think this whole issue shows the absolute crucial importance of watchdogs. And I'm referring to the Parliamentary Budget Office federally, the Auditor General federally, and provincially, and the FAO, because this isn't a criticism of the opposition members of Parliament, MPPs, but government has become so large and so complex that we need the extraordinary professionalism, objectivity, nonpartisanship of an organization like the FAO or the Auditor General to ferret out these issues in the first place so that we can talk about it on your program and hopefully develop solutions going forward. And I hope the FAO does come up with solutions to create a roadmap for the future so that this won't happen again, maybe using, as I said, essentially a de facto negative income tax or setting up other mechanisms to ensure that unspent funds are properly accounted for and recorded and can be turned back to the legislature for debate over reallocation, that sort of thing. But we need really good data, and that's coming from the watchdog agencies.
All right, that takes us back to Mitch. And Mitch, let me get you to comment on this aspect of the story. I guess the Conservative brand, as it likes to portray itself, is we're kind of tight on spending. We don't believe in profligate spending. And the requirements of this COVID-19 pandemic have required us to make some decisions that are very off-brand for Conservatives. Do you think that has been part of what has made it difficult for this group of decision makers to do their thing?
For sure. I mean, I don't think anyone had, Doug Ford runs province's largest deficit on their bingo card for this mandate, right? Before the pandemic started. And the reality is that in times of crisis, that money needed to go out the door, and the Premier's done that. We should keep in mind that although not as much as was budgeted was spent, it's still the largest amount of money that's ever been spent on healthcare in the province's history. It's still a $16 billion deficit. It's still a excessive amount of money that was put aside and that was spent to make sure that people were protected. And we also have to remember, I think it's an important contextual point, because hindsight is 2020. When they put those projections in the latest budget, they did that in February and March. And that was when we were in the midst of arguably the worst point of the pandemic in Ontario. So projecting out that it was going to be very bad for a while was something that they did. And then it turns out that we actually got the vaccination rollout that we needed, and that case spread and positivity rate came down, and here we are with less financial need to accommodate those things. So I do agree with the majority of the panel about the importance of the watchdogs. I do agree that the government needed to spend money to make sure that it was protecting the lives of citizens. I just don't think it's as cut and dry as saying, did you spend exactly what you put aside, yes or no, and therefore you did everything you can.
All right, but Deb Matthews, could you follow up on that by answering this question? Have lessons been learned, and will they be applied in the future?
Oh, I hope so. Who knows whether they'll be applied in the future? That's the sad reality. But I think you've got to shine the light on this kind of thing, and you've got to hold the government responsible. I mean, a lot goes on within the ministries that you don't have a lot of political control over, but there were some political decisions made here, some very irresponsible, incompetent activities by this government, and they have to be held account. We can't, we can't just let it slide. And there was a company that got $10,000. It had a reported loss of 2 cents. And if you're going to tell me that company lost 2 cents and they get to keep the $10,000 that they should never have received in the first place, I've got a problem with that. And it's a political decision. You asked earlier about the politics of going after companies this close to an election. I tell you, if people knew what was going on, if they knew that businesses had received far more than they had lost, I think the politics is clear. You gotta put that money where it belongs. Get it back to government and put it into those things that need attention.
Ian, I'm down to my last minute and change here, and I guess I want to know, you've looked at numerous governments over the years. How confident are you that this government has learned lessons from what's transpired over the last year and change and will do something about it going forward?
I'm going to give you a sort of quasi-political answer, even though that's not my domain. I think the more serious the criticism that Ms. Matthews was referencing, the more public the condemnation, then and that comes back to the watchdogs. The more because of the late Justice Brandeis' famous phrase that sunshine is the most powerful disinfectant of all. And so the more that these kinds of scandals are exposed, then I think governments are going to be more willing to learn the lessons and apply the lessons to ensure that they don't happen again.
Gotcha. That's the last word on this discussion. I want to thank all of you for coming onto our program tonight. Ian Lee from Carleton University's Sprott School of Business. Mitch Davidson, Executive Director of Strategy Corp's Institute of Public Policy. He used to work in Premier Ford's office. Kim Wright, the NDP strategist and the principal at Wright Strategies. And Deb Matthews, former president of the Treasury Board, former health minister, former minister of advanced education, what the heck else did she do? She was the minister of everything back in the day. Thank all four of you for coming onto our program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, no.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.